Welcome to Brain Chatter. Join us as we explore real-life examples of leaders who listen past the daily noise, lead themselves and others with clarity, and make an effective difference on the front lines of leadership in life and work. I'm your host, Derek Brown. Today's episode is A Giant Money Pit, Employee Turnover, and our guest is Kyle Roed, Global Human Resources Director of CPM Holdings in Waterloo, Iowa, and host of his own podcast, Rebel Human Resources Podcast. I'll link to both Kyle's podcast, CPM Holdings, and Kyle's LinkedIn in the episode notes at brainchatterpodcast.com, along with the other articles and resources we mention in this episode. Kyle, welcome to Brain Chatter.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. I'll loop back and do a deeper introduction of you, your company, and your podcast shortly. But to start us off, I thought I'd introduce today's topic about retention and turnover with some sobering information about the costs of turnover. First, from a 2019 article by the Gallup organization, their estimate on voluntary turnover and replacement costs annually inside U.S. businesses is $1 trillion. And it identifies much of that as self-inflicted by many of these businesses. The same article references 2017 numbers from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics showing that the average voluntary turnover inside U.S. businesses annually is 26.3%. The article further paints its stark picture by estimating that if there were a 100-employee company with an average annual salary of $50,000, the turnover and replacement costs would range between $660,000 and $2.6 million per year. Kyle, I know this is no secret to the human resources world. What are your thoughts on the challenges of turnover and retention in general, and from your personal observations in your years as an HR professional?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share that. And some of those statistics are not surprising to me. In fact, most of my career has been highlighting some of those challenges and concerns and arguing that we need to take action on some of it. So as far as the challenges of turnover and retention, they, in my mind, are the root cause of a lot of the challenges that we face day in and day out in the world of HR. So, you'll hear a lot about people who are trying to hire and can't find good talent. You'll hear a lot about people who feel like there's, quote, job hopping and people don't stay at employers for a long time. But I tend to flip the script on that a little bit and ask people, is it really a staffing problem or is it a turnover problem? Because we all know that if we aren't retaining our top talent or we're not giving our team a reason to stick around, then there's plenty of opportunity for them to go elsewhere, and that can hurt an organization. I think the one thing that I would argue, though, as it relates to the cost of turnover, is we're talking about human capital here, which is the sum total of all of the good and bad things that people bring into an organization. It's always kind of a mixed bag, and you really can't put a true number on it in a financial capital lens. You can do your best, but I would argue that the organizations that have high turnover don't just have higher costs associated with replacing turnover. They have cultural costs. There's a cultural ripple effect to organizations that are high turnover, and that leads to instability. When you have high turnover within your leadership ranks, it's going to be exacerbated. And ultimately, you will start to degrade your product or your customer support within your organization if you don't address some of these things.
Absolutely. And in a different article, this one was in Forbes, and I'll link to this in the episode notes. Bill Connerly, an economist and the author of Bizonomics, From the Headlines to Your Bottom Line, provides a step-by-step guide for a company on estimating the costs and costliness of turnover in any given organization. Just like you said, there's a lot of places that you have to go out and discover where those costs exist. And as with a lot of costs, management may not realize its actual size because the cost factors are scattered across different parts of the organization. those costs are often siloed and not fully comprehended in any sort of informal assessment. But as a reference point, he provides some generalized estimates for the cost of replacing a single lost team member in a company. He says, quote, off-the-shelf estimates are available, which might set the cost of an entry-level position turning over at 50% of salary, mid-level at 125% of salary, and a senior executive at over 200% of salary, end quote. Obviously, those are very hefty numbers. That means if an entry-level position pays $30,000, then to replace that person would cost $15,000. And if you know the pay scale of an organization, you can quickly see how dramatically that scales up. How often do you think close to accurate accounting of these costs end up showing up on any kind of report or spreadsheet that is actually taken seriously by company executives and seen as something that's modifiable with effort?
Yeah, I think your question is very reflective and hits close to home. So, first of all, I would say I think that estimate that's probably pretty close. The 50% for an entry level, mid level 125, senior executive over 200%. I think that's probably close. My answer to your question about having it on a report or a spreadsheet, for me, comes down to that specific organization. The only time that I have seen that within my background within an organization has been when there's an organization with a really strong HR function that also has operational business clout and the ability to articulate the accurate accounting of those numbers. So I'll give you an example. At one of my companies, we actually had a project, a cross-functional project with accounting, and we took the various inputs from each of our individual locations that go into hiring and training a new hire. And that was the calculation that we then used to extrapolate the total cost to the business. When we did that, we found that we were costing the organization upwards of $15 million a year in turnover cost. And what that did is that actually prompted multiple projects within each location to start to address some of those issues and really do some root cause analysis on why. So just by doing an accurate accounting project that was validated and supported by the finance team, we were able to articulate the problem, but then we also prompted additional insight into how do we go address it. So, I think that's, in my world, we're a for-profit world. That's the only way to get momentum in my mind.
So one thing you mentioned just then was in organizations where the HR component of the business has operational and business clout. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How you see that clout being developed and what makes the difference there?
Absolutely. I think, and this is my call to action that, I get pretty passionate about it, but I view HR as a critical business function. And in order to be a true business partner, we have to know what our business is. and ultimately, we have to understand what the different business functions do and understand how our business works. And that's as simple for me as how do we make money? Who are our customers? And how does that translate into the bottom line of the organization? So it's really what I would consider kind of like a fundamental analysis of how the business works. And once you get that building block and that foundational understanding of the organization that you work within, then you can start to align your HR strategy to the business strategy. And ultimately, you can go talk to any C-level executive. That's what they want from HR. The days of HR being the quote personnel department where, you're just processing payroll and you're an admin function and you're overhead. In my mind, I think those days are past. HR is being called upon to be a true business partner, to help be a perspective on the business, to help the business, A, be profitable through effective talent processes, but B, also support that human capital and the people, and ensure that your processes are supportive of what they need as well.
Absolutely. One of my coworkers is a former HR director at an industrial facility, and she says, her name is Kim McNanny. She says that one of the things she's seen over time is a lot of times the HR manager for a site will not go to maybe the daily morning meeting or any of the shift meetings because they don't see that there's any value in that. But she said there's a tremendous value in that just because you're at the table, then you're thought of more often, and then your input is more valued whenever decisions are being made, and you can sort of get ahead and be proactive. Have you seen that before, where it depends on whether or not the HR person is actually at the table?
Absolutely. And I think the term, a seat at the table gets thrown around a lot, but I don't think it's as big of a feat as a lot of people think. At the end of the day, you just have to be there and show up and provide a perspective. And if you show up day in and day out to those types of meetings and you provide value, then people will rely on that and support, some of the initiatives that you know need to be done. So, an example I can use here. So, this has been many years ago in a previous employer. I came from a very progressive organization where HR was kind of like the town mayor, going around making sure everybody was happy, checking in, seeing if we need to adjust things here or there to make people's experience better. And then I transitioned in my career into a manufacturing environment, and it was a very different perspective of what HR was. It was, you walk the floor and people are like averting their eyes because they don't want you to come over there because they feel like you're gonna get them in trouble.
Yeah.
So totally different environment, and something that I wasn't expecting. But as I walked into that, I realized really quickly I was going to have to get my pulse on the organization somehow. And so I just started showing up every morning to the standing meetings that the supervisors had. And then I would just make it a point to float around between daily huddles and just show up. and what would end up happening is somebody would say, "Hey, Kyle's with us. Kyle, do you have anything to share?" And I would share, whatever initiative was top of mind, or maybe just recognition or what have you. But it's as simple as that. You build the relationship, you start to build the clout, and then I also started to learn. And I did that for a good 6 months before I tried to roll out any sort of like brand new initiatives. And ultimately, the foundation of trust and understanding was really what, in my mind, allowed me to be successful in that role.
That makes a lot of sense. To loop back earlier to what we were talking about with the costs, there was, in that same article I was talking about related to turnover and retention, the Forbes article, the author goes on to describe some of those costs that he identifies scattered across the organization. And I'll just run through these really fast. It'll be a little bit wordy, but I'd like to get your thoughts on this. He says among the costs, there's the time it takes for HR to conduct an exit interview, to process all the components of the termination and the benefits, the cost of advertising the new position wherever you do that, the time cost of reviewing resumes and holding interviews, of drawing up offers, the time and costs of leading an orientation and enrolling the replacement person or people into benefits. And then while the position's open, that work is likely covered by other employees, diverting attention from their normal workflow and lowering their own productivity inside their actual role, maybe even being paid at a higher rate for overtime, or work simply piles up and is not completed or is rushed, impacting quality, like you said. He mentions that open sales positions, that's a torpedo directly for the top line. And then there's the stress to other employees whose positions touch those open positions. And when the new person's finally on site, there's all the training, the time and cost of all that, the supervisor and manager's time, and then the coworkers who continue to help the new person and impact their own lower productivity or focus in their own role. And then the mistakes that often come with being new in a position, not to mention the customer service interruption to the end clients, just the pile of costs go on. You even mentioned some others a few minutes ago, but if an HR director's trying to make the case for all of these costs, where do they start?
Yeah, that's a long list. That is tough to understand where to start. I would say it's relatively comprehensive. The only thing that I didn't see in there or didn't hear was cultural impact. And eventually, what I have seen is you get one department that starts to see a little bit of turnover, the stress starts to build. You have a few more people leave. It's almost like this snowball rolling downhill where you can actually have a great performing department and then one key person leaves and 12 months later the department's on fire because it's just this kind of this cyclical issue. And when you have really key talent leave, there is a ripple, and it really can be extremely disruptive. And if you don't address it, or if you don't fill the position in a timely manner, the cost and stress and pain of having that open position just continues to get worse and worse. So it's definitely a high urgency issue, and a huge pile of financial costs. But there's some intrinsic cost there that's not quantifiable through dollars and cents. Yeah. So to circle back to the original question here, where do you start? Me, I'm a data guy. So, if I'm having issues within a specific department, or if I start to see a turnover spike, the first thing is realizing that it happens either at the time it happens or having some sort of a leading indicator that there's a risk of it happening. A lot of times we're too reactive to the point where we don't know that turnover is an issue until turnovers, double digits. And now we are panicking because we're trying to put the fire out, but then we're also trying to build the house at the same time, and it just keeps catching on fire. So, so I encourage people go do a deep dive into analytics. If you're not good at statistics or data analytics, go find someone in your company that is. In my current company, I have a fantastic financial planning and analysis director that helps me with some of those modeling, and that's her thing. So I'm going to let her do her thing. I'll do my thing, right? So leverage your internal expertise and go in, and a lot of people will tell me, well, I don't have that data. I don't know that. Yeah, you do. You just don't know how to collect it. So an example of something that we did, we were having a significant issue with turnover in a manufacturing setting, specifically with our female population at one of my employers. And we couldn't figure it out. And in the data, what we were seeing in that department is we were just having a huge spike of people getting terminated because they had too many attendance incidents, or we had people who were just job abandoning within the first few weeks of their job. Obviously, both of those things are bad. But ultimately, the way that we actually got the data and figured out there's something we can do about this is we actually just went out and started talking. We went and talked to the coworkers on the line that were standing next to that person day in and day out and said, hey, do you know why so-and-so left? She seemed to be doing really good. And what we found was, as we went through and we started to have these conversations and understand some of the qualitative data, is the fact that daycare was an issue. A lot of it had to do with the fact that the hours of that department were not conducive to the hours that most of the local daycare centers provided. So people were asking friends and family to watch their children until the daycare opened, or there wasn't enough available daycare within the area to provide it. So what we ended up doing is we went and partnered with our local child care resource and referral authority. We made sure that we found an area that these individuals could go to get referrals for qualified, safe daycare providers. And then the other thing we did is we looked at our shift start times and we said, well, this shift isn't working for these folks. What if we just move the time back an hour? Would that shut down operations? And the initial reaction is, well, yeah, we can't do that. And then if you ask why, the reason you'll find is, well, it's because we've always done it this way, which is inherently part of the challenge in a lot of environments. So we found out we could change the time. So we did. And we saw the turnover slow down. And so it's one of those things where you've got to go a little bit deeper than, I have X% turnover. You've got to understand why. And ultimately, this is where HR adds value in my mind. Ultimately, you have to keep your pulse on it. You have to understand the real stories and the real implications, and then understand what can you do as a employer to help support success.
Absolutely. What a great story and outcome. I know that you mentioned that your current employer in a previous correspondence, you mentioned that CPM Holdings has a lower turnover than many of the companies in the industry. Could you say some about how you attribute and manage that lower than average turnover and what sort of got you that way?
Absolutely. So, yeah, I've been with my organization now going on almost 3 years. And I'll be honest, when I started here, we weren't really doing a lot of the things I'm talking about. We weren't tracking it. We were relatively laissez-faire in a lot of our management practices. And so the first time that I went out and did a true deep dive of our data and put together a dashboard for, kind of for HR results, I was shocked at the turnover number. I was like, okay, this can't be right. And so I go back through and I relooked at all the inputs and made sure that I didn't have a formula off somewhere. And sure enough, turnover was low single digits. Like, I want to say that first year I was looking at it, it was right around like 13, 14%. The industry average in my locations is usually anywhere from 35 to 45%.
Wow.
So significantly lower. So I'm like, okay, something's wrong in the data. But sure enough, it was accurate. And, it was interesting. My perspective, I came from the world of retail, which turnover was 80 to 90% on average annually. And then I was in a manufacturer that was what I would consider maybe a lower wage manufacturer. And that turnover rate was right around 30 to 35%. And then I came to my current role. And there were a couple inputs that I would attribute that to. I think the first very clear finding, and I know some employers will not like to hear this, but we pay our people appropriately. We look at the external market, and wages are market comparable, and they are livable. They're a livable wage. I think that was one very clear finding, and it just makes everything easier. Now, it's not always an option for an employer with razor thin margins, but we are fortunate at my current company to be able to do that. But I think if you go maybe away from wage and benefits, because it's certainly an input, but it's not necessarily the primary reason that somebody stays. Because the other comment I would say is, especially in manufacturing and skilled manufacturing jobs, you can go find a job pretty much anywhere for about the same, if not a little bit more, money per hour. So there's other reasons outside of wage inflation, or I would reach market wage paying. And I would actually say that through the course of my discussions and findings, people stick around for 3 primary reasons that are not related to wage. The first one is they like the people they work with. And I was shocked at the number of people who were close friends outside of work. They go hunting and fishing and drinking and go to each other's kids' sporting events. There's just that connection was there. And if you think about it from a human perspective, if I get to go to work and hang out with my friends all day, that's a great place to work. And so if I want to leave an employer, I'm basically leaving my friends. So,
Yeah.
I think that there's a ton of inertia that's built by just making sure that your employees are friends with each other. Now, a lot of HR people are going to recoil at that and say, yeah, I don't want, then you get this whole relationship in the workplace kind of thing. And I would tell you, yeah, I've got people who are married that work at my company that weren't married before they started there. They got to know each other at work, and guess what? Now they're married. Which isn't necessarily the HR goal, but it happens, and I think it's a sign of being close knit. So I think number one, people like their coworkers. Number two, empowerment. And I would say this is such a buzzword right now. I kind of hate to use it, but that's truly what we saw. So empowerment from the standpoint of people are not micromanaged. There's not somebody flagging, okay, you've been offline for 15 minutes. That means you're loafing. You better go hit them up and say, get your productivity back up. That's not how it is. It's much more laid back. The goal setting is relatively informal and could be more formal, to be quite honest. But it's also very comfortable. People understand, okay, in my job, I have a goal of doing this. I'm going to go figure out how to get there. And we don't necessarily have all of the lean manufacturing processes. We could have more of that, but I think people actually enjoy that because it's a creative process at times at work. So it's mentally stimulating, and they don't feel micromanaged. And then I would say the kind of the third commonality, the third criteria is really strong leadership. And when I say strong leadership, I don't mean like, you're a dictator that's like telling you thou shalt go and do this, come hell or high water. I'm not talking like the Theory X leadership. I'm talking strong leaders that care about their employees. And, I think it circles back to the friends at work. My managers know their employees on a personal level. They understand that when COVID-19 hit, so-and-so has really little kids. They are really going to struggle during the hours that their children are awake. We are fine being flexible with them completing their work after the kids go to sleep, or being more productive after the kids go to sleep, rather. We're okay if somebody is on a corporate presentation with executives on the line and their kid busts in and is like yelling and asking for a snack. It's funny. And at one point, I remember this was back in like April, May, back when everything was quarantined. At one point I got onto a call and I think everybody had some sort of a giant beard going on because nobody was shaving at that point. So, but it's like, it's that kind of culture where, my leaders truly care about their employees as people and give them an opportunity to succeed as people. And I think if you boil that down into more of an analytical, kind of a human capital lens, what that allows them to do is understand somebody's intrinsic strengths and opportunities, and then they can modify the work instructions and the work expectations in order to fit that person's specific brand of execution and output. So long-winded example, but those are kind of the three major findings.
Absolutely. And like you said, not things that can be captured in a spreadsheet as much as some people may wish they could be.
Yeah, sorry for all the bean counters out there, but it's some of this stuff is a little touchy-feely.
Well, let me go back and do a better introduction of you now, Kyle. Kyle is the Vice President of Human Resources for CPM Holdings, Incorporated. In that role, he oversees the various aspects of human resources for their 27 domestic and international locations in 11 countries. Kyle previously held progressive HR roles for Fortune 500 organizations, and most recently was the Senior Manager of Human Resources for Omega Cabinetry. As I mentioned earlier, you can also listen to Kyle's views as the host of the Rebel Human Resources podcast, which you can find on Apple Podcasts and other major podcast outlets. I'll also put a link in the episode notes. Kyle is also a board member of the Cedar Valley Society for Human Resources Management and co-founder of Disrupt HR Cedar Valley. Additionally, Kyle serves his community as a board member of the Iowa State Rehabilitation Council, One Cedar Valley, and Cedar Valley Kids. Kyle earned his bachelor's in business administration from the University of Iowa Tippie College of Business and holds the certificates of professional and human resources from HRCI and the Society for Human Resources Certified Professional from SHRM. Cal, I know, as mentioned in your bio, you're very involved in your local chapter of the Society of Human Resource Management, often just called SHRM. That gives you a chance to regularly network and idea share with other HR professionals, and it gives you a chance to both hear about their successes and their challenges and even their horror stories, and to learn more about how they approach and deal with all three. From those conversations, can you summarize what the conversation around employee retention and employee turnover are often like in those kinds of settings? And do you hear the same sorts of issues over and over, or do you hear issues that are all over the board?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I am fortunate to get to network and know a lot of really talented HR professionals through my networking. I would say that the approach is very drastically different depending upon the industry or the company that the person works at. So a lot of times the topic of turnover is a really big issue for those that work in the healthcare, retail, and manufacturing sectors. That's just where my network feels the most pain. Some of the other industries are a little bit more insulated. Typically, the more professional industries don't deal with that. And so, in the context of the higher turnover industries, I think the conversation is usually complaining about people who are leaving for minimal dollar increases. So it's a concern that somebody who is let's say they're an entry level engineer in a manufacturing organization, maybe they're leaving for $1,000 or $2,000 more per year. When an HR professional's like they would have gotten that in their raise had they just hung out for another few months. It's some of those challenges that I hear, and then a lot of times the conversation revolves around not being able to find replacement employees for some of that turnover. That's the challenge. And so, what I've seen, at least in my local community, is it's almost like there's this talent churn, as I would call it, where employers are just kind of taking one employee from another employer, and that employer has to replace it. And so it's this constant cycle of hiring and replacing open positions. So it's definitely in the context of disruption. For those HR professionals that are in organizations where the turnover rate's a little bit lower, a lot of times I'll hear more conversation related to cultural improvements. And it's not so much a focus on preventing turnover, but the focus is more on optimizing their organization so that they can leverage the team that they have in a more effective way. So it's drastically different depending upon how good or bad your turnover is within your company.
Absolutely. For a lot of those entry level positions, do you hear a lot of conversation about the lack of certain basic skills, and by that I mean like the basic skills that an employee needs to come to work knowing, like that you actually have to come every day, that you're scheduled, or that you ought to treat your fellow employees with respect, those very kind of basic human skills. Do you hear that across the board as a challenge, or not so much?
Yeah, I mean that is one that transcends the industry. I think there's a general challenge with what we would call the soft skills, and you mentioned many of them. It's the attendance, it's the having the appropriate attitude, being willing to learn, following directions. I hear a lot of concerns about people who question authority to the point of being almost insubordinate because they think that their way is better than their the way that they're being told to do it. So I think that I hear that, though a lot of that's cultural, just cultural clashes of people who just have differing perspectives towards work. But yeah, that's a lot of the work in the community that I've done has been with some of those local education institutions to help them understand, what are some of the challenges that we see. And then, my perspective is position-based training and work-based training is a really great way to overcome that hurdle and ensure that people are set up with great training up front, but also ensuring that some of that workplace training includes some of the cultural training within your organization, because every organization has this like these unwritten rules of what you're supposed to do. So like for instance, when I started with my current company, my shift always started really early at my last company, so I scheduled a meeting at like 7:30 in the morning. And I got so much grief from people who are like, don't schedule any meetings until after 8:30. Nobody's had their coffee yet. Don't do it. But it's like one of those things. Well, that wasn't in the handbook and I didn't know that. So, sorry about that. Thanks for the feedback. It's stuff like that, right?
Absolutely. Well, from your experience, are there any really low-hanging fruit, as the saying goes, when it comes to addressing common causes of employee turnover that are the very basics that every organization ought to be addressing, but that you notice plenty of organizations just being oblivious to or not prioritizing?
That's a great question. I think the universal agreement is make sure your communication protocols are in place. Just be good at communicating. Even if you just open up the channels of communication, have a good open communication policy, listen, learn, provide feedback, provide transparency to some of the things that you do or some of the decisions that are being made. That's going to help, not just with turnover, but just in general. So I would say focus on communication. I think the other thing that's maybe a little bit more tactical is very simple, and that is do exit interviews if people leave. Make sure you actually facilitate that discussion so that you actually get the real feedback. But then I would take that up a notch and say the next level up is something called a stay interview. And a stay interview is much more proactive than an exit interview. At the point of an exit interview, you're not going to save anybody's job. They've already made the decision. That even if they're conflicted about it, typically an exit interview, you're not going to convince someone to stick around. You're just gathering data. A stay interview is an opportunity to actually go to somebody, ask them very similar questions to an exit interview, but you're asking them, why do they stay? What keeps them there? What are some things that keep them up at night? And then the key point here is, and then you take action on it and improve. So, I would say that the actions that are going to need to be taken off of some of that data are going to be completely different depending upon the company. But if you enact some of those things, you will be able to have some data, you'll be able to have some actions, you'll be able to leverage your employees' feedback in order to make it a better place to work. Great
insight. Well, just as 100% employee turnover might be a horrible issue, and obviously also an indicator of a broken company culture, so of course too can 100% retention be a sign of broken company culture. And I'm sure we've both seen examples of that. Can you speak to that and expound on what healthy turnover is and why you want it?
Yeah, that's a great point. There is a healthy turnover number, and I think it's pretty simple. It's the fact that as people grow and mature, their lives change, their goals change, and it's not always going to align with the company that they work with. So, I would argue at those companies where there's 0% turnover, there's probably a number of people that are still showing up to work, but quit many years ago.
Yep.
And are just there because either they're paid too high and they don't want to leave the money. And so they're just kind of phone it in as so, they fly under the radar. Maybe there are people that are actively, searching for a job, but nobody's hiring them for whatever reason. And then I think there are people who, there are actually people who are like actively disengaged and are like, their job is to make their work worse for everybody else. I mean, I've ran into those people too. You don't want those people sticking around. So, Yeah, it can be unhealthy. As far as what a healthy level is, that's going to depend on the organization. I think that in a really small team with really close knit relationships, small business, maybe family run business, something like that. You know, having an annual turnover goal may not be appropriate. It might be like you might expect to see healthy turnover. Maybe one person quits every few years. So I would argue that it's not necessarily applicable to look at it on an annual level. In a larger employer, I think it really depends on the situation there. So you can look at studies. I mean, I've seen research studies that say, you should just assume that 10% of your workforce is a bottom performer and 10% just needs to go, and you just need to, you know, um, force rank everybody, and then the bottom 10% gets removed. I don't necessarily prescribe to that thinking. I think that's a little bit Machiavellian, and I would argue that healthy is relative to the organization. But if you have people who have already quit and just haven't given you notice yet, then you need to facilitate an opportunity for them to go somewhere else in whatever shape that takes.
Absolutely. Have you witnessed examples of where, when a broken company culture is being adjusted and transformed, that turnover actually increases during the process before later decreasing?
Yes, I have. And that's scary. I mean, their cultural change is hard. And depending upon the study that you look at, it'll tell you either 3 to 5 years to actually impact true cultural change. So you've really got to take the long view. But when you are making change and you see turnover spike, you get that feeling in the pit of your stomach that maybe you're doing something wrong. I would just ensure that if you're doing some of these changes, if you're making improvements, don't do it in a silo. Don't do this in a vacuum, and be transparent and open with yourself and with your leadership team. Because the leaders are the ones that are really going to feel it. The frontline supervisor, a lot of times everything falls on their shoulders. If turnover's spiking and you're doing all these initiatives and you just keep doing them, and that supervisor isn't involved in the strategy or the approach, it's going to be more painful, and it's going to get really noisy. And a lot of times the changes that might be the right changes will get abandoned, and things will just fall back to the way it was. And so, if I could use an example here. So one of the strategies that we employed was an immigrant hiring approach, where we brought in individuals that did not speak English as a first language. And so in order to ensure that we could bring people in, train them appropriately, do that in a safe manner, we brought in our local community college to teach English language learning classes on site. We brought in some trainers that were multilingual that could help facilitate the training. We layered in this structure to help support these individuals. And what we saw was that there was some initial turnover as we started to bring some of these individuals in. And, had you just looked at that on the surface, you would have thought, oh no, this isn't working. We need to abandon this. But what we found out was the root cause of the reason that they were leaving was not the fact that the program was bad. It was the fact that our selection process was off. We weren't giving them a realistic job preview and then giving them an opportunity to either accept or decline. They basically thought that, they had to take it because we weren't going to listen to them or accept any feedback. Ultimately, by letting them self-select and say, oh, you know what, this isn't for me, we were able to find the individuals that actually stuck around and saw a huge improvement in turnover. But it was a selection process issue. It had nothing to do with the project to impact turnover. And so, before you look at a surface level data point, you have to dig a little bit deeper and truly understand, okay, what's the root cause here? I like to use the 5 why analysis. It's maybe an overused tool, but it helps break down that barrier between what's actually happening and what do I think is happening.
Ah, yes. In a recent Brain Chatter podcast episode, our guest was Kelly Caruso, CEO of Shipt, and she, in conversation, told me her most useful question of insight that she asks her direct reports. And her question is, are we solving for the same problem? And of course, her point is that makes everyone define the problem that they're working on to make sure that it is, in fact, the same problem. Do you have a most insightful sort of go-to question that you like to ask your team and the other managers in the organization?
I do. I don't. It's probably not that insightful. I love that question, by the way, because defining the problem is the first rule in fixing a problem. So it makes perfect sense. But I would say, I maybe I wish I had a better question than this, but the question that people will tell you that I always ask is, help me understand.
Ah, yes.
And it's a lot of times that's in the context of understanding why a decision was made, and then kind of backing into understanding somebody's reasoning and logic. And so, but help me understand is it's an opportunity to open up the lines of communication and it's an active listening technique to actually get to the root of what the appropriate conversational direction is, as opposed to going in and saying, why did you do that?
Yeah.
It's a very different approach. So help me understand would be my approach.
That's great. And I know you're probably not as you're not as accustomed to being on the side of the podcast interview that you are today, because you are a podcast host. And thank you so much for changing seats and letting me interview you. What made you decide to start your podcast about human resources? And are there any great insights you've gained from it already?
Yeah. I appreciate you asking the question. And, so the podcast was really my effort to fill the void that hit me and my extroverted self during the quarantine. I was missing my HR network. We weren't having in-person meetings. We were doing some virtual Zoom happy hours, but it just wasn't the same. The depth of conversation wasn't there. And so this was really a way for me and some of our local SHRM chapter members to put our thinking hats on and facilitate some of that networking in a more structured manner. And really the intent is to provide a different perspective on the lens of HR, talk to innovators within the space, and just understand, how can we all, kind of find our tribe and continue to support each other in a really volatile and disruptive world where HR is being asked to step up and do more with less. So, that was really the reason for the podcast. As far as what I've taken away from it, I'll be honest, I feel like I'm learning learning more than anybody else, because I get to have these great conversations with these really great professionals. And I listen to it once when we have the conversation, and then I listen to it twice when I do the editing. So I'm actually retaining some of this knowledge. So it's been great. I feel like I'm back in school.
Absolutely. I completely understand. And just two more questions. Over the years of your career, are there any resources, whether they're books or periodicals, blogs? Obviously, I know your podcast it certainly will be one of these. Any other resources that you think would be really useful to someone who wants to learn more about what we've discussed today?
Yeah, so I am a SHRM member, and SHRM is the largest professional network in the world for HR professionals. I think 300,000 plus members. They have a lot of great content. It's not free, but they do have a certain number of free articles before you become a member. So you could just simply Google SHRM and Google the topic, and you can typically find an article at low cost. I think the other thing too, there's a ton of free content out there right now. And I actually encourage folks to go get connected on LinkedIn. with HR practitioners and professionals. Twitter, there's like a whole HR Twitter group that I get a lot from. I get about just as much from the comments in a LinkedIn post as I do on an article, because I'm hearing somebody else's perspective. So there's a ton out there, depending on what you're looking for. And feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And I connect with anybody. I always like to build that network and connect.
Absolutely, and I'll link to your LinkedIn in our episode notes as well. What else should I have asked you but did not? Is there anything else you'd like to offer before we go?
That's a great question. I think the only thing that I might add is the fact that while it is very difficult to capture some of the financial ripple effects of turnover, I do think for many organizations, they still need that. They need the dollars and cents, black and white, actuarial value of turnover. And so if you're struggling or you're thinking, well, my organization isn't going to want to do this, I would challenge you to not ask, just do, and then share your findings. And if they tell you they don't want you to do that anymore, then you can stop then. But I guarantee you, if you go to a motivated accounting professional and say, hey, I want to try to figure out how much turnover costs, they're going to love it. It's going to be a fun project for them, right?
Yeah.
And a good opportunity to collaborate. So that would be maybe a call to action for those that are thinking, where do I start?
Thank you for your time on the podcast, Kyle. For the convenience of those listening, we're going to post a link to Kyle's bio, to his LinkedIn, and to more information about Rebel Human Resources podcast, as well as links to the articles and other resources we discussed. Those can be found online at brainchatterpodcast.com. Brain Chatter is a production of Ken Chapman and Associates, Incorporated. We assist clients across North America and beyond with leadership development, corporate culture transformation initiatives, behavior-based professional development for health and safety issues, individual and team assessments, conflict and performance management, succession planning, and team building, making a difference in organizations and individuals' lives for almost 40 years. Learn more at leaderscode.com.